Since 2017, roughly 100 North Shore Congregation Israel folks have journeyed to the south, to the deep south, for a 3-ish day journey, beginning in Atlanta and moving to cities in Alabama, Montgomery and Selma and Birmingham, walking in the footsteps of the civil rights movement's leaders, King and Parks, meeting people who were involved in the movement then and who continue to do the work of justice locally and internationally today. What joy it is to visit now our friends in the South each time. And the last trip we took was in February with 40 of the adults, many of whom are sitting in this room. Just stick your hand up in the air if you were on our journey. It's wonderful to reconvene our group here for this reunion. And we have 3 participants who are going to share reflections of the journey, not so much the details of the trip, that you can talk with me afterwards, but the impact and the power of engaging in real conversation and exploring these holy sites together. And so first, Taryn Kessel.
It was about a year and a half ago when I was sitting in this sanctuary listening to a student share his experience on the Civil Rights Tour, and it was during that service I made the commitment to myself that I would sign up immediately at the next opportunity. It's been 8 weeks since 40 of us traveled to Atlanta, Montgomery, Birmingham, and Selma, and I still think about and am still processing this journey like I just got home. We packed so many powerful moments in just roughly 72 hours. There was the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I saw the bus stop where Rosa Parks launched the civil rights movement and the Montgomery bus boycott. We mourned the many unthinkable losses of victims at the new Legacy Museum, which evoked the same gut-wrenching sadness I have felt at any Holocaust memorial. And of course, my favorite moments were meeting real people who were a part of the movement, who marched, who risked their lives, and who are still moving in the movement. Joanne Bland was around 10 years old when she marched with her family and community from Selma to Montgomery in 1965. It was definitely the time we spent with Joanne that impacted me the most. It went from a trip about me learning, me experiencing, a trip really about me, to an experience of what can I do about all of this? This trip became not really about me, but what am I taking home to my children? I couldn't and still can't really fathom sending my kids into harm's way, even in the name of freedom. When Joanne asked us, "Do Black lives matter?" she then answered and said, "All lives matter. We are all pieces to a large puzzle." I feel a bit ashamed about how limited my understanding of the civil rights movement was and perhaps still is. I can remember being a kid and thinking these kinds of atrocities happened so long ago, but really how long ago could it have been when I have the luxury of seeing and hearing a woman like Joanne Bland tell me about her story, the tears and bloodshed, and how she still works in her own community for equal rights, equal opportunity, and enhancing the lives of so many in the aftermath of the movement. Towards the end of our time with her, she invited the group to take a rock from the exact grounds of where leaders like Martin Luther King stood as a reminder of her story and everything we heard and saw on this trip. We can put it in our pocket to remind us to pass it on and to think about it. My rock really doesn't belong in my pocket. Sometimes it belongs on my kitchen table, the nightstand when I'm reading with my kids, or anywhere where I can follow through with Joanne's asking of me. She said, "Tell your children my story and bring them back here to see it for themselves." I feel very empowered by this task, not just to keep the conversation of our country's history and stories like Joanne's alive in our home, but also to inspire my kids and teach them to collect more rocks, to hold on to the truths of our history, and to use that knowledge and compassion to repair the world.
Beautiful. Amy and Dan Kaufman.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you to the rabbis for giving us a chance to share some reflections as well. Taryn captured it so beautifully, and actually we did not compare notes at all, and it's remarkable how similar some of our reflections will be, so hopefully they'll resonate even more with you if you hear them again. We knew that this trip would be very enlightening and fast-paced, and in fact, the very first night when we got there, when we checked into the hotel at Atlanta, Rabbi Geffen did not waste any time instructing us on one of the fundamental principles of our trip: do not be late for the bus. So in all seriousness, it is difficult to capture the impact of this trip and of our few days together of learning about and experiencing our troubled and complex history with civil rights. The trip certainly was transformative in many ways. And while it was about the history of the civil rights era, it was and is about our present and future state of civil rights and social justice. When we met with, in Birmingham, Alabama's historic Kelly Ingram Park, we met with Reverend Calvin Woods Sr., who's a pioneer of the civil rights movement, and he brought more of the history and its present-day impact to light. Reverend Woods shared with us his memories of his planning the movement with Martin Luther King, and I was struck by Reverend Woods' incredible courage and resilience. No matter what faced him, no matter what obstacles he and others faced, they just kept moving forward. And in the middle of his reflections, periodically, Reverend Woods would break out in song as his expression of God. And I remember distinctly one of the songs that he sang, which was, quote, "Segregation is not going to turn us around," close quote. Now, my family generally forbids me from singing in public, but this was one time when I was determined to sing and compelled to sing along with Reverend Woods, and along with our fellow congregants, who I think we all heartily and genuinely really joined in singing with Reverend Woods. And it was really a nice congregational moment. And it certainly had some healing and inspirational qualities to it as well. But I was left to wonder and think whether I could have even mustered some of that same resilience that Reverend Woods had and the others who marched and who endured during that time. And I also wondered how I could, or if I could, have some semblance of that same resilience to tackle some of our issues today. And speaking of congregational moments, our discussion tonight, as Rabbi Daniels noted, seems particularly relevant given Passover and our just finished reading the Haggadah and the celebration of Passover. And in our Haggadah, as you know, when we discuss the Maror, the Haggadah states, quote, "Wherever slavery remains, Jews taste its bitterness." Close quote. Our trip made us realize more that we as a country have accepted and continue to enable, in many ways, certain attitudes, policies, and practices that have developed from slavery into a sort of systemic suppression, and a suppression of African Americans and other people of color today. And how we choose to respond is the big question. Let's call it the fifth question.
In addition to the usual reflections about the Holocaust during Passover, which we've always done in my family, our trip continued to lead me to think of my own family history. Like many of you, I'm first-generation American-born. My parents were German refugees in the 1930s. While they left many family members behind, there were family members here who helped them get settled. My dad's family settled in the Bronx, and my mom's family settled in Washington Heights. My mom's father was a butcher, my dad's father was a furrier. And my parents would tell you that despite the tremendous hardship that they came from, that they had a relatively normal working class kid experience growing up in New York City. After high school, my dad went away to college, and he was able to pursue his passion for journalism. Along the way, he worked at the New York Herald Tribune, for those of you who remember that, and the Washington Post. And at the Washington Post, he became the editor in charge of Woodward and Bernstein and the Watergate investigation. So this trip really made me think, and I talked to Rabbi Daniels about this extensively, what would have happened if my dad had been born black instead of a German Jew? Would he have been able to have the same level of success and the same education and the same experiences? And of course, the repercussions that has for my whole family. As this trip made us increasingly attuned to the harm that has been done to people because of race, this question really penetrated our being, and Dan and I talked about it a lot. It's thoughts like those that made us realize that while we thought we knew a lot about this history, we really did not understand it and fully appreciate its impact. Like Taryn, I'm just going to run down quickly the things that were so impactful walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the reenactment of Rosa Parks not moving from her bus seat, which is done by hologram at the Rosa Parks Museum. You'll never forget it once you see it. The bus stop, I completely agree. And then the Legacy Museum and the Legacy Memorial. I know most of you haven't been to those places. They're relatively new, the Legacy Museum and Memorial. A lot of people refer to the Legacy Memorial as the lynching memorial. And it consists of large steel columns hanging from a rooftop, and each column represents a county. And on the beneath the county name is a list of names. Those names are the people who have been identified as having been lynched in those counties. And it's a dynamic exhibit because as they discover more names, they will add those names to those columns. Each of those columns has a duplicate, which is stored outside of the main area, and the hope is that each county will come and claim its history and display it in its own public park or in its own public way. So we were obviously tremendously moved by this, and I too had that very overwhelming sense of shame. If I had to come up with one emotion that represented what the culmination of those experiences would be, it would be shame. I'm going to skip the part about Joanne because Taryn talked about her so brilliantly. So all of these experiences added a special dimension to the trip. But Rabbi Geffen really cautioned us, and we took it really seriously, not to expect that everybody was going to have the same feelings from the same experiences. And I think most of us really took that to heart. But she also cautioned us to not let the feeling, the urge to do something, which was a very common emotion that was expressed while we were gone, that the challenge would be for us not to let that urge to do something atrophy after we got home and got involved in our daily lives. This is so true. We all have different and sometimes very personal ideas of how we might want to make an impact, whether it's big or small. For me and Dan, we really see more clearly now that discrimination, whether it's overt or whether it's not, is everywhere. It's in housing, it's in education, it's in our justice system, it's in childcare. And it's everywhere in a different sense, too. It's in Selma, and it's in Montgomery, and it's in Birmingham, but it's also in Glencoe, and in Highland Park, and in Northbrook, and in Chicago. So we find ourselves asking ourselves, are we doing what we can, or are we succumbing to that atrophy that Rabbi Geffen cautioned us about? And the reality is that all of us have limited time and resources. So realistically, what can we do? We realize we cannot fix everything, but we hope we do not use that as an excuse to do nothing.
Brian Stevenson, who is the extraordinary founder of the Legacy Museum and Memorial, and just gave a remarkable TED Talk a few years ago that it was suggested that we review that before the trip. At the end of that TED Talk, he was asked, what can we do? And he suggested that those who want to do something about degradation or marginalization or injustice get involved in the fight to end the practice of placing convicted children in adult prisons to serve their sentences. And he raised $1 million just by zeroing in on that cause from that suggestion. And I think that's such a powerful example of the way he picked one cause and zeroed in on it. And it seems that that's something that we can learn from and zero in on an issue. We can pick one or two, whatever it is, to help meet basic unmet human needs and also to try to work to correct some injustices. It seems that we can do something to make sure that everyone, regardless of their race or their zip code, is given opportunities that they too deserve, just as my father-in-law had when he was a new immigrant here in the US. And I had a paragraph about Joanne Bland, but you've heard about her a little bit. I did bring my Pebble though, so I do try to look at it, hopefully as often as I should. Fortunately, we ended this trip with a lot of hope. We attended the Sunday church service at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, where Martin Luther King and his father and grandfather had preached. It was the same congregation, but a different building. And the service and the congregants were warm and uplifting and full of hope. And I feel like we were inspired and learned a lot from them, as we did from this whole trip. And with apologies to Rabbi Geffen, thank goodness we didn't miss the bus. So, Shabbat Shalom.
To Taryn, to Amy, and Dan, thank you so much for your powerful reflections and words. I know that everyone who came on this trip with us had their own individual experience, and I know would be happy to share those reflections with you at our Oneg Shabbat if you so choose. And if this information has inspired you to maybe want to join us on our next civil rights journey in the next year or two, please do tell Rabbi Daniels, or you can tell me and then I'll tell Rabbi Daniels, or Rabbi Green or Cantor Goldstein will relay it to him so we know to keep you informed. I will just say that this question of this horrific legacy of slavery and discrimination endures in our country. And you don't need to go far. You can go as far as, I'm not sure what the distance from here to Garfield Park is, probably 20 miles is my guess. The lifespan in Garfield Park is 16 years shorter than it is here in Glencoe, just for an example. 1 in 3 African American males will serve time in prison at some point in their life. Just a straightforward statistic. And if that doesn't sit right with you, and I hope it doesn't, because we as Jews really do have a particular reserve on assuring that the stranger is loved, that the other is brought near, that we are proximate to anyone who feels not inside, because we are empowered with an outstretched arm, right? We hear about that in our story. We mimic the divine in the freedom that we now nourish and cherish for ourselves. And if we cherish it for ourselves, our tradition demands that we extend it and stand up for it for others. And there are so many ways to do that that really just involve us getting proximate. If politics isn't your thing, and I know for many of us it is not, it involves meeting someone from a different community, learning their name, hearing their story, and being there to lend a hand when needed. It's literally that simple. And if you don't know how to do that, we have any number of relationships here at this synagogue with communities on the west side in particular, the African American community in particular, and many of us have developed wonderful friendships there. It's a concrete way to make a real difference. It doesn't matter what political party you're a part of, who you voted for president, or who you'll vote for the next time. It's just about people of good faith coming together to help make this world a little bit better. So we hope that that's a message that everyone can not only take with them for these days now post our celebration of freedom as we journey toward the ultimate redemption and revelation, but really one that you can pass on and inspire to others. You don't have to have gone on the civil rights trip or be a clergy person to know the importance of this message. And in that